So,
I didn't think about that.
I think this should be a full
Thanks.
copy.
That's one result I wanted to check.
Mark? I can't see them. That's perfect. That's fine. Yep. Yes, I can see it. Hey, hush.
Yeah. This was
The name of the, forgetting the name of the seal manual.
this was very interesting because these are kind of. Do you mind if I
No, no,
just
go
hold
take
on to
it,
it?
yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Salem, Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Programs here at the Middle East Institute. Welcome, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome back my good friend Jim Zogby, co-founder and president of the Arab American Institute and managing director of Zogby Research Services. Jim, again this year, as he has done several years in a row, has led an effort to examine public opinion in Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE. A research task unique in its scope and rigor and undertaken in cooperation with the Sir Bani Yas Forum. He'll speak about the aims and methodology of the poll, provide highlights from the findings and interpretation. The published report is available in hard copy with us here today, and I think it's online on the website of Zogby Research Services. This event will be live streamed and recorded for posting later on our website, so please put your cell phones on silent mode. As December looms, our programming year nears its close. I want to call your attention to our full-day conference on Turkey, led by our colleague Dr. Gönül Tol. It's an annual conference on Turkey. It'll take place on Monday, December 4 at the National Press Club. The slate of speakers includes members of the Turkish, German, and EU parliaments, the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Turkey, and other policy practitioners and respected analysts and scholars from both sides of the Atlantic. The very next day, on Tuesday, December 5, in the afternoon, we present a discussion of the conditions facing members of the religious minority groups in Iraqi Kurdistan. So please visit our website. You can sign up for all of these events there, MEI.edu. Today, we'll start with a presentation by Jim on the findings and highlights and so on. Then we will go to our panel for their takes and perhaps comments or questions, and I will sort of moderate that discussion. We have a great panel with us today. To my immediate right is my good friend Barbara Slavin, director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council, and a correspondent for the online news magazine Al Monitor. To my immediate left is my friend Yousef Munayyer, executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and an MEI scholar. And to my extreme right, Dr. Gönül Tol, who is the director for Turkish studies here at MEI. Their bios, Jim's bios, their bios are in the flyer that you picked up as you came in. We will then have ample time for your questions and comments, and then we end promptly at 1:30. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to turn this ever so slightly. There. Thank you. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Mark. Thanks to the Middle East Institute. We've become partners in this. I think we've been doing it every year now for the last 4. But for the last 7, I've been given the opportunity working with Sir Bani Yas Forum, which is a project that happens annually, co-sponsored by the United Arab Emirates Ministry of Foreign Affairs and now CSIS. It used to be Chatham House, and now it's CSIS. We have an opportunity to poll across the Arab world, but also in Iran and Turkey. And in many instances, it's the first time polling, face-to-face polling, gets done by someone in Iran. We actually, just as a humorous note, we had to get an OFAC waiver to be able to do it. So I'm pleased that we were able to get these results. I think they're fascinating and tell an interesting story, especially if you trace them over the 7-year period which has been a period of conflict and convulsion in the region, to see where attitudes have gone. And then, after they're discussed by thought leaders at the forum in Sirbaniyas, we have an opportunity then to present them to an audience here in the United States. Let me begin with a series of questions that we asked about regional attitudes toward the Trump administration. The numbers are actually not as instructive as one might have hoped. They're kind of mixed, and you'll see as we go forward. First, attitudes towards Trump policy in Syria. What you see are that pluralities almost everywhere, except in the UAE and Turkey, find that policy more negative, but mixed, not overwhelmingly, only overwhelmingly negative in Egypt and Palestine. Everywhere else, the attitudes are mixed. Since the election of Donald Trump, how do you view policy toward the conflict in Iraq? Again, it's the UAE and Turkey that give positive numbers. Larger pluralities find it negative in Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. And attitudes are mixed and divided in Saudi Arabia, also mixed in Iran. How do you view U.S. policy then on dealing with Iran? Very negative in Turkey and in Egypt, somewhat positive in UAE and Saudi Arabia, and pluralities divided, but still pluralities negative in Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and in Iraq. How do you view Trump administration policies toward your own country, U.S. relations with your own country? Negative in Egypt, Lebanon, and Palestine. Mixed, interestingly, in Iran, leaning negative. Somewhat positive, but not overwhelmingly so, in Saudi Arabia and UAE, because you have a very significant number of folks saying remaining the same. I focused on two issues, Palestine and Iran, because these issues are looming large in the U.S. policy debate, and I'll present them in some depth to you. If you look through the material itself, you'll see we cover a range of issues, many of which I'm not going to present now, although panelists may want to talk about them. They're all available on the website at zogbyresearchservices.com. Do you think President Trump will be able to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Not an overwhelming vote of approval or confidence. The only place actually where a slight majority see it, are somewhat confident, is in Turkey. Which resolution of the conflict would you support? What you see here, I think, is indicative of a growing mood in the region that the conflict has spun out of control. It's gone on too long and it's become too entrenched with an intransigent Israeli government and at this point a rather dysfunctional Palestinian polity. 40% or more in Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, which are the principal players in this, since they have Palestine itself, but then also large Palestinian populations in Jordan and Lebanon that border, 40% see peace is not possible at all. Only in the UAE and Saudi Arabia is there and Egypt, those three, is there a sense that the two-state solution is still the most desirable outcome, with one state being favored by Iraqis and Iranians, but also a significant number of Palestinians. Almost 40% Palestinians say one state. What's been talked about is this great deal that President Bush is proposing, and you hear a lot of talk about
President Trump.
President Trump.
It's hard to say.
You still
Trump,
haven't gotten
Bush.
used to that?
I'm still having trauma from the Bush administration years. And I'm not ready to face the new trauma sometimes. But you talk about the Great Deal, which is somehow going to involve an Israeli-Arab alliance to confront Iran, and all you have to do is solve the Palestine problem. Let's see how people actually feel about that. The Green says it would be desirable to have an Arab-Israeli relationship with Iran, but only on the condition that the Arab Peace Initiative is fulfilled, the terms of it. Israel ends the occupation and fulfills the terms of the Arab Peace Initiative. The Purple says it should not be pursued, even if Israel fulfills the terms of the Arab Peace Initiative. And the Gray says it's desirable no matter what. Only Turkey actually has a significant number of people saying desirable no matter what. Look at the numbers in UAE and Saudi Arabia that are often talked about as key partners in this arrangement. Within the margin of error, about 0 say it would be a good idea even if Israel did not. So that obviously the issue of solving the Palestinian problem only would win over half the polity in most of these countries, but half would still oppose it even under those terms. Let's look now at Palestinian opinion. Are Palestinians ready for peace? The numbers are pretty much the same as we've seen before. About 2/3 are ready for the Arab Peace Initiative to be implemented, but 27% say they don't think Israel's going to fulfill those terms. There's a sense that Israel, under any circumstances, isn't going to do it. And 32% have just given up and say they just don't think it's possible, and they're not ready to make any kind of arrangement at all because they don't think it would be a favorable one to them. How do Palestinians feel about their leadership? Well, not good. Majorities are not satisfied with the authority and not satisfied with Hamas, but Hamas, the number is 69% not satisfied with Hamas. Only supporters of Hamas are satisfied with Hamas. In the West Bank and Gaza alike, 30% are satisfied and 70% not satisfied. The numbers for the authority are pretty constant all the way down, about 46, 54%. Unity. Much talked about Palestinian unity. Is it important? Overall, 70% say it is important. Jerusalemites being the most inclined to say that, but only 37% are confident that it will ever happen in the next 5 years or so. And again, those numbers are pretty constant among all factions and in all regions. Because it was the 50th year of the occupation, we wanted to get a measure of the impact. Two of the questions we asked had to do with, have you or members of your immediate family suffered violence at the hands of the Israeli military, police, border patrol, or Shin Bet? 35% yes. Have you been victimized by Israeli settlers? 30% said yes. I found most interesting here the numbers in Jerusalem. 54%, and they are 69%. Jerusalem and the condition of Palestinians in Jerusalem remains an untold story that I think needs to be given greater attention. We asked the importance of relations with various countries, principal players, regional and international. Russia, United States, obvious, but then also Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. The numbers in previous years for the United States were always 20 to 30% greater than Russia. This is not a rating on how favorable you are toward that country, but how important a player is it? How important is it that your country have relations with this country? Look at what's happened to the Russian numbers since 2016. If Putin's done anything, he has established Russia as a player in the region. The numbers, in particular in Turkey and in Jordan, climbed the most. It's interesting that the numbers have gone up despite the fact that is Russia playing a positive or negative role for the conflict in Syria. Only in Iran did a majority say yes. Everywhere else the numbers are fairly substantially negative, except in Palestine where the numbers are somewhat split. But look at the numbers in Turkey or in Saudi or Jordan or Egypt. And because Russia has been the major patron of Bashar al-Assad, a question that we've asked before and ask in this one, is it possible to have a solution that leaves Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria? Regionally, the answer overwhelmingly is no, including, I might add, in Iran itself, which is also a key player in backing up the Bashar al-Assad government. Now we asked, going back to Iraq, questions about the U.S. role in Iraq and Iran's role in Iraq. U.S. is viewed only favorably in Saudi Arabia and UAE, somewhat still a plurality opposed in Turkey, but not doing badly there. In Iraq, 36% say it's positive, and 36% say negative. Iraqis are divided on the question of the U.S. role. What's interesting is when you ask about Iran's role, again, you're going to get, with many of the Arab countries, a strong negative. But look at the Iraq numbers. The Iraq numbers are fairly heavily leaning against Iran's role, and that includes all segments, including Shia, Sunni, and on the Arab side, and Kurds ethnically, find that Iran's role has not been positive in their country. What's the best future for Iraq? Well, there was a significant change here in the last time we did this question, which was 2 years ago. We found back then that Iraqis, well, let me start here. Reforming the government in Baghdad, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and UAE was seen as the most important step forward to restore unity, national unity in Iraq. But look at the Iraqi numbers, with the politics in the country being divided on that question. That was not the case 2 years ago, when Iraqis very significantly said reforming the government, making it representative of all components in the society. Today, Iraqis are divided on that question, and again, that division goes literally across the board, with Shia, Sunni, Arabs, and the Arab number there, a cumulative one, and then the Kurdish numbers being there. Just let's take a closer look at how Iraqis view other countries' role in their conflict. Again, divided on most, negative on most, but divided. Saudi Arabia is the only one that earns strong negatives, but Iran, Turkey, Russia, negative, split on the question of the United States. What's the best outcome for the Kurdistan region? Now, this might surprise you because we just had an election there, and the numbers came out supporting separation and independent Kurdistan. Overall, Arabs, Turkey, Iran, not supportive of it. But even in Iraq itself, the Kurdish numbers and they're jumped over a space. The Kurdish numbers were slightly more favorable toward an independent, but majority said that it should remain an autonomous region as part of Iraq. Now, difference here is that we polled Kurds throughout the country. We had significant responses in Sulaymaniyah, which is heavily PUK, which was opposed to it. In the polling that took place, the election rather that took place, only 55% turnout in Sulaymaniyah. And so I stand by these numbers as a reflection of where Kurdish opinion is on that question. Divided, not uniform in terms of independence. They see the upside and the downside of both options. This is the question of what to do about the JCPOA, the Iran deal. Only in Turkey is a majority in favor of enforcing the deal, and only in the UAE and Saudi Arabia was there a plurality, and Egypt was there a plurality or a significant minority in favor of scrapping the deal. Everywhere else there was a lot of division on the issue. and obviously no real regional consensus. Let's look in terms of internal Iran attitudes. And this, I think, is the one that's going to set the stage for everything else. We asked Iranians how they felt about the implementation of the JCPOA. Only 24% were satisfied. 46% said that Iran had met its obligations, but the West had not. 30% said Iran has met its obligations, but the West will not because it's hostile to Iran. So 76% of Iranians from the start begin with the assumption that the West has not lived up to its arrangement. And that perception of hostility, or the reality of hostility, in the case of the utterances of President Trump, has had a decided impact on opinion on other issues. And I want to just look at a couple of them. We've asked these questions in previous polls. How satisfied are they with the government? The government, in other words, has been strengthened by this external sense of hostility. A majority still feel that they're not getting the degree of advancing democracy and protecting of personal rights that they'd hoped for, but they do feel the government's made efforts in other areas. And the most important one here is 2016-17, the difference between giving support to allies in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, where the numbers went much higher in 2017. And I want to look at this next slide carefully, because when we began asking this question of how important it was that the Iraqi government stay involved in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, it was very high. And the numbers dropped in 2015 and then dropped precipitously in 2016. But then they've gone back up in 2017. And the only factor I can account for there, the only factors that I count for that is, number one, the sense, the perception of victory in Iraq and Syria, and the sense that the West is being hostile. And there was an article in the New York Times recently about the backlash as a result of that. And I think that that's a way to get, and this creates a policy bind. There's a concern in the region and in the West about Iran's regional role, and the need to kind of rein it in or somehow force some degree of disengagement from conflict areas where Iran has been meddlesome. But at the same time, the danger is that it solidifies support for the government and for those very same policies that you want to end. And that is the result as we've got it so far. Thank you very much.
Wow. Wow, thank you, Jim. That's an extremely rich set of issues and questions that arise from looking at that. I think we'll make this sort of almost a discussion with Jim, get remarks and reflections. Then if you have any questions to Jim, we'll do it in that way. I'm going to start with you, Barbara, and then go to Yousef, and then go to Gönül. And in each time, we'll also get Jim's responses. So what stood out for you?
Yeah.
Your
Sure.
remarks.
First, thank you, Paul. Thank you, MEI, and thank you, Jim, for inviting me again. I think Jim touched on a number of the findings that deal with Iran. So I'll maybe amplify a little bit and add a couple of other things that I thought were quite interesting. This Iranian disappointment with the implementation of the JCPOA is something that we've seen in other polls. University of Maryland does a series of polls in Iran, and back last January, actually last December, so almost a year ago, 77.5% were not confident that the United States would live up to its obligations under the JCPOA. And so the numbers that you got in your face-to-face poll, I think, just reflect the fact that Iranians now believe the United States has indeed not lived up to its obligations. Some of the other findings that I thought were interesting had to do with the role of religion in Iran, and there were some contradictions there. But this finding I thought was fascinating. There was a question about whether religious movements should restrict themselves to personal faith and spiritual guidance, or should they play a direct role in political life and governance. And in Iran, 66% said that religious movements should indeed restrict themselves to personal faith and spiritual guidance. I remind you, this is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think this reflects increasingly secular trends in Iran. And you have a sense there, and this is not just in Iran, maybe also in Saudi Arabia to some extent, that nationalism has replaced ideology, religion, as the glue that holds these societies together. And of course, they're reacting very much to each other. Jim, you mentioned the increasing support for Iranian intervention in some of these conflicts. And I think that we saw a drop-off. A lot of Iranians do not like their resources and personnel expended on what they call Arab causes. But two things have happened. ISIS, and in particular the ISIS attacks on Tehran in June, had a big effect on Iranian opinion, the notion that they had to fight them over there so they didn't have to fight them at home. And also the growing campaign by Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman and the United Arab Emirates against Iran has triggered this enormous nationalist backlash against them, and the sense that if, say, intervention in Yemen is really annoying to the Saudis, let's continue it, because it's a relatively small expenditure on the part of Iran, but it really has bogged the Saudis and to some extent the Emiratis down in this horrible conflict. Now, this figure of 66% saying that religious movements should restrict themselves to personal faith and spiritual guidance. By the way, the figures in the other countries are fascinating. In Egypt, it's 81% real backlash against the Muslim Brotherhood. In Saudi, it's 85%, in the UAE, 84%, and in Turkey, 84%. Now, Turkey, of course, where you've had the AKP. So again, I think we're seeing an increasing sort of secularization in the sentiments of people. Only in Iraq, Palestine, were there fewer than 50% in support of that. Now, there's some contradictory findings, because the survey also shows that Iranians believe, 62% say religious government has improved the lives of citizens. Well, again, I'm not sure that they're being entirely honest about that, since it completely contradicts the other statistic that you have in the poll. So I'd be curious about that. The other thing I thought was interesting was that Iranians are expressing more satisfaction with their own government and with their government's record in improving the economy and creating employment. This contradicts some of the other polls that I've seen, where people still say unemployment is the biggest problem facing Iran, and economic problems are really severe despite the JCPOA and the reform efforts undertaken by the Rouhani government. One other finding that is consistent in that is that Iranian respondents are not satisfied with the degree of democracy and personal and civil rights that they're experiencing under their governments. So it's an interesting mix. A couple of other things I thought were interesting as well were that, let's see here, that Iranians were more confident than the Saudis and the Emiratis that the United States would resolve the Arab-Israeli dispute. I'm not sure where that comes from. I thought that was really, really bizarre. But, the United States still is seen as somewhat more powerful by Iranians, perhaps, than it is by other governments in the region. And the final thing that I thought was very important, and here there is a consensus, that in Iran, as elsewhere in the region, they are perfectly happy to see Bashar al-Assad go. Everybody in the region sees him as damaged goods and does not think that there's really going to be a solution to Syria with him still there. So that's something that potentially countries in the region could build on if they were all willing to talk to each other.
Thank you, Barbara. Jim, any comments on that? And let me, if I may, add two questions.
Sure.
The one, if you would say a few words about the methodology and the number, how many people you polled and how you did it, particularly in countries like Iran. And a second question I'd like to tag on to Barbara's. given everything that's going on in Saudi Arabia and sort of the attempt at transformation and through the polling, this polling or even tracking from previous years of Saudi, is there an emerging profile that gives you an understanding about the dynamics of Saudi public opinion, how they might be interacting with what MBS is doing?
Yeah. First, on the first question, we polled the last page in the report that you've all been given, or if you check it out online, it has the full methodology described. We polled 7,800 plus overall. It was, in most countries, it was 1,000, smaller numbers in Lebanon, Jordan, obviously, and the UAE. We polled only citizens in UAE. The methodology was all face-to-face. The process we've used is described here. In every country but Saudi Arabia and UAE, it's door-to-door. Cities divided into quadrants, and quadrants are then broken down into smaller quadrants, and quotas are set so that we reflect the overall demographic composition, and viewed controversial by some, but it's the one standard that every polling company uses for demographics. It's the CIA handbook. It's the one place that you can go to get an in-depth profile of every country in terms of education levels, gender, religious breakout, et cetera. If those numbers are wrong, then everybody else's numbers are wrong because everyone works with that. Both the methodology and demographics are spelled out in the report.
And in terms of getting permission to do this
No.
door-to-door,
We don't
how do you do that in countries that are challenged?
we don't ask.
You don't ask, never ask permission.
I don't ask you, or you don't ask
I
me?
don't ask. We don't.
You just do it.
Just a funny story. In Egypt years ago, we were polling for MBC, Middle East Broadcasting Company. It was a survey on television viewership. We were polling in 6 Arab countries, and one of the countries we were polling in was Egypt. I think it was 8 countries we were polling in Egypt. We got all of them done except in Egypt, where the people we were working with insisted on submitting it to the government for approval. Weeks went by and it didn't come back, and then more weeks went by. All the other countries were done. I was in Egypt and happened to visit with Osama Obaz, who was working, obviously people will remember him, he was very close to President Mubarak, and he said, don't ever do it again. Don't ever do it again, just do your work and do it. So we finally got it back from he got it back for us from the government office, and the guy, I can imagine this poor bureaucrat getting an order from the president's office to send the poll back, and he had questions stricken that couldn't be asked, and it was like, what do you watch Thursday nights between 6 and 9, stuff like that. It was totally irrelevant to, there was nothing controversial that he took out. It just left holes in the Egypt poll. We also don't work with established companies in the countries because we find that in several of the countries, people have a leaning one way or another, and we've been victimized by that. And so we have a field team that goes and hires directors in country who then go through a training process with the people who are doing the work on the ground. And it keeps it as neutral as is conceivable. With regard to your question, Barbara, about contradiction, there are lots of contradictions in polling, and you find them in American polls as well. How do you get 96% in Turkey saying that a religious government makes the country weaker when it's an AKP party that's running it? And so there's a sense of denial. This isn't a religious government. Turks 84% want religious movements to restrict themselves. 96% say when religious movements govern, they make it weaker. We don't have a religious government. We have Erdogan and the AKP. I mean, there's a sense that they don't connect. In Palestine, after the experience that they've lived through with Hamas and the unfavorability of Hamas, 61% say religion should play a role in political life and governance. When asked do they make countries stronger or weaker? 74% say they make it weaker. What does it mean? It means is that when asked the question, should religion play a role, Palestinians say, yeah, of course it should, but they don't connect, they're not connecting the dots. And so, frankly, the way to get to the bottom of this, and what we've proposed at times, is to actually do focus groups, to say, what do you mean when you say this? Because the polling you can't get the why out of a poll. You can only get the what people think, not so much what's going on and how to connect the dots between the questions. And
On Saudi?
on Saudi.
Is there a profile?
Oh.
How do you understand Saudi? Yeah.
Look, polling gives you a snapshot. The only way you determine where trajectory is going is by connecting the snapshots and trying to make a movie out of it. We've done polling in Saudi Arabia, and this is a fast-moving train. So what we have found is that initially, the MBS program, the Mohammed bin Salman program, actually was received very positively by young people in particular. And in UAE, you always get, when you ask the question, are you better off than you were, and do you think you're going to be better off in the future, 80% saying yes, better off. There's a sense of dynamism and optimism that did not exist in the same way in Saudi Arabia. It has started to take place. What will the effect of the current recent arrests be? I don't know. And I think that those are things that occur along the way that make you have to question, like, did the Trump tweets of yesterday have an impact? I don't know, but I think if we polled again, you'd probably get a shift in some ways. In Lebanon, we found that we always had a convergence between Christian and Shia views on Iran. And where will that be now after the Hariri episode? I don't know, but I mean, this is something that means I know where to look, but I need to do another poll to find out what the dynamic is there.
Thank you.
If there was one other question I had for you, Jim, and that I understand why the Turks are worried about U.S. policy toward Iran because they have close economic relations, but I couldn't understand why Egypt seemed to be so upset about U.S. policy toward Iran. Do you have any idea?
Egypt's been playing its own role in the region, and especially in its relations with Iran. They actually have, rankled some of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, over their overtures to Iran. So apparently it's there in public opinion as well. Just back to your question, I think that the Saudi Arabia thing is absolutely fascinating, and it requires more of a sort of a deeper dive right now to see where they're going. I mean, this is a country that has undertaken a massive overhaul with a 2030 vision that in education, in several areas, has actually been quite substantial. But then there's these other countervailing, the Yemen war, et cetera, and the setbacks in Syria, one, and who knows what's happening in Lebanon, too. How that plays together. Is this an LBJ scenario that's playing out? I don't know, where one conflicts with the other and sucks the energy out of it. I just don't know, but I think that, we'll see that unfold in years to come. But I think it's an unsettled situation right now. All the right things being done. This is building the great society, but it's got Vietnam.
Interesting.
And the question is, how's that going to play out?
I hadn't heard that before, LBJ on the MBS analogy. Yousef, let's get your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul and Jim, and thanks for putting this event together and keeping the focus on the public opinion of people in the region, which I think is very important, especially when often it seems that the governments there are not very interested in public opinion in the region. I had a few observations that largely were focused on the Palestine portions of this. The first that I thought was really interesting, and you alluded to it. You alluded to it, Jim, was that on the issue of the preferred solution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you have almost, looking at the report, it's almost 2-to-1 in Palestine of the people who prefer one of the solutions to the other. It's 38-to-21 that prefer a one-state outcome to a two-state outcome, which was really remarkable to me, because that is, numbers have been trending in that direction in Palestine in polls that we have seen over time. I've never quite seen such a stark difference in opinion on this issue as in this poll. But given the situation on the ground, this is obviously not surprising, and of course, has important implications for what the future of a solution would be when you have Palestinians moving further and further away from this idea of a two-state outcome towards a one-state outcome. Of course, the Israeli government is moving in a similar direction, or has moved in a similar direction, with a very different vision of what that one-state outcome is. And at the same time, you have an American government now who has refused to utter the words two-state solution or two-state outcome, adding to that issue. I also thought what was really interesting, again related to this question, is that when you look at the numbers across the different countries, the countries that where there is the most significant support for a two-state outcome is Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. And there is a fascinating correlation between the respondents in those countries who say they prefer two states, and the same respondents who say they have no faith in the United States being able to get to a solution. And I believe it was the previous, in Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, the same respondents that prefer a two-state outcome are the least confident that an American administration, this American administration, will be able to resolve the issue. And that, I think, I would venture to guess that that's not necessarily about President Trump, right? Because we know that, looking at other data here, that actually it is those states where we see a more friendly attitude to President Trump and his policies in a couple other places, relatively speaking. And we know, of course, that the Trump administration has had stronger relations with some of these governments as well. I think it's more a function of the reality on the ground being so starkly different from the preferred outcome that they have, which is a two-state outcome, and seeing a reality which is anything but moving in that direction. So I thought that was very interesting. The point that you raised about the question of Jerusalem, Jim, and the people there and their interaction with the Israeli security forces or the settlers, and it being particularly high in Jerusalem. I think one of the things that explains that is just the structure of the situation. You have, and I looked at the methodology and the sample and so on in Palestine, 70% were from the cities, right? And these, of course, are people who are primarily in Area A of the West Bank. That means they live under Palestinian security jurisdiction. That means that their interactions with Israeli security forces are actually, and settlers, are more limited because they are primarily living in those spaces. Whereas in Jerusalem, of course, you have a much larger Palestinian population, a large settler population which is interacting with them, and of course, Israeli security jurisdiction only. So I think that has a lot to do with it, and I wouldn't be surprised, it would be fascinating to look at the crosstabs at the respondents from outside the city. The 20% in refugee, or the 29% in total that were polled from villages and refugee camps, to see what their experiences are like, because in those situations, you are far more likely to interact with Israeli settlers. You are far more likely to interact with the more brutal face of the occupation in the form of settlers and checkpoints and settler violence as well. A couple other things that is very important, obviously, now, given all of this conversation about ultimate deal or whatever else, the idea of normalizing ties with Israel prior to some sort of solution for Palestinians is roundly rejected. And in the places where, as you pointed out, You hear most conversation about that with Saudi Arabia, with the United Emirates. It is most rejected. So clearly there is strong public opinion there opposed to that I think leaders would do well to take good notice of. And the last thing, and we kind of touched on this, but I think it's really fascinating, that last slide about sort of Iranian public opinion towards Iran's involvement in other states in the region, and really the dramatic swing in public opinion just in the last year. And I would venture to guess that, because this poll was done in September, I think it was August and September, before this very consequential November in Saudi Arabia, that those numbers will likely only continue to go up. And what we're seeing is sort of a rally around the flag effect in Iran that is a response, in part to a more active and more belligerent Saudi Arabia, but also in response to an American government which is giving a blank check to those policies. And so the question that you raise about this catch-22 for policy is a very, very important one, and I think one that will just become more stark in the year to come.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yousef. Jim, your
Let me
comments
just
on that?
respond first on the Palestinian attitudes on one or two state. You're correct, it's 2-1, but what makes it more significant is that another 40% say peace is impossible, which ultimately translates to one state. And it's quite depressing as someone who's worked on this issue. I actually can say longer than you, because I'm old. But I mean, it's been a project that you and I have worked on for most of our lives. To see the degree to which there has set in a kind of a despair in Palestinian opinion, which I think is significant, and where that takes us in the future, I don't know. Just as when I look at Israel, I see no way to create any combination of parties that will move the country in the direction of peace. I also don't see in Palestinian internal politics right now how you begin to shape a leadership and transform the government, the authority, into something that can inspire people in a different direction. I've met some extraordinary young Palestinians, but they're not in the position of providing that degree of national leadership that can change the dynamic. On the question of Iran and Saudi Arabia, I think that it is a dilemma. It's a real dilemma. And I made the mistake of referring to George Bush, but I don't think any of us will ever be able to fathom the depth of the error of the Iraq War and what it did to the region, and the consequence of basically weakening U.S. standing, demonstrating that, unlike the Project for a New American Century's hopes that it would not become the hegemonic power, but actually would ultimately get replaced by regional powers and create a multipolar world, and the unleashing of Iran. Which, despite the fact that Iraqis are not favorable toward Iranian intervention, Iran's there and has a very significant role in the country, and now in Syria, and certainly in Lebanon. And they boast about Yemen. You're right. I mean, it's a small expenditure, but it's an irritant, and it's there. The fact, I think, that the last administration, I don't think, appreciated the extent to which this problem could spin out of control, and needed something different in the way of American leadership. I'm glad they negotiated an arms deal, but there were bigger fish to fry in the region, and they didn't have their eye on that ball. And that only made Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries incredibly nervous about where the future was going to be, with Iran here, and there, and them feeling threatened. We've seen in our polling a growing sectarian mindset that didn't exist a decade ago to the extent that it does today. And it does threaten progress in all of the different countries. And while the Iranians may be rallying around the flag, it's not helping Iran grow. It's not helping Iran transform itself. They're rallying around a flag that is leading them in a direction of increasing regional isolation. And so, you know, and the Trump administration isn't helping provide a corrective to that. And so this is a worrisome situation. I think it's important that the Saudis are taking the steps internally that they are, but I worry that those steps are confronting other problems that are going to conflict and ultimately have the potential of canceling one, canceling the other out. So this is a very worrisome time, and I think we need a different direction, different thought leadership, and I only hope that what the polling provides is just some insight as to where the minefields are, where the problems are, and where current policies are taking us, which is not in a necessarily productive direction.
Thank you, Jim. Gönül, let me turn to you. Thoughts on either Turkey or anything else in the polling?
Well, I was quite surprised by the findings, but I want to start with something that did not surprise me, and that's the Turkish views on Russia. Obviously, the majority of Turks think that the relations with Russia is quite important because Turks feel victimized by Russian actions. After Turkey downed the jet in 2015, Russia imposed sanctions that hurt Turkish economy and also deployed S-400 missiles in Syria. So Turkey felt threatened both economically and strategically. So in 2016, the relationship normalized after Erdogan apologized. So Turks feel that they are dependent on Russia, so having a working relationship is very important. But there's also one other factor that we don't hear much in DC, and that is some people ask, well, Turkey often, the Turkish society is against the U.S. for its cooperation with the PKK, the PYD, and yet Russia doesn't even consider the PKK. I'm not talking about the YPG, which is the Syrian militia, as the PKK as a terrorist group. Mm-hmm. So how come Turks view Russians so positively? I think there is this dimension of Turkey also, I think the Turkish community feels that the Russians are also the victims of the West. So they belong to that same club of the excluded. So I think that's the perception in Turkey, which brings me to the second point, which really surprised me, the positive views in Turkey about the U.S. role in Syria. Given the timing of the poll, it was conducted in August and September 2017, and that was a few months after the U.S. took the decision to directly arm the YPG. So in a separate poll conducted by Pew around the same time in August, 72% of Turks view U.S. as a national security threat. So I don't really understand how the Turks view U.S.'s role in Syria positively. It's seen as a supporter of terrorism in Syria. So I think that's a big question mark. Also in Iraq, I mean, there's not a huge difference. Only 43% of Turks view U.S. role in Iraq positively, whereas the 42% says it's negative. Again, Turkish public opinion, anti-Americanism in Turkey is at an all-time high. And Turkish public has always opposed to U.S. intervention in the region, and especially in Iraq, because Turkey suffered a lot after the first Gulf War economically, and they think that the autonomous Kurdish region is a direct national security threat. So they've always opposed to U.S. intervention in Iraq. But one explanation that I can offer is, again, that could be the timing given the KRG referendum in September and the stance that the U.S. took. It was very anti-KRG, referendum. So that could explain the positive view among Turks vis-à-vis the U.S. role in Iraq. On Iran, it's not surprising, as Barbara mentioned, Turks do not, it's a very complicated relationship between Turkey and Iran, but still Turks do not approve Trump's Iran policy. They're in favor of enforcing the nuclear deal. Turkey is dependent on Iran for its energy needs, and there's a lot of trade, also historical and cultural ties. So many Turks, they don't view Iran as a military threat. So that's straightforward. Another interesting finding was the one on political Islam, as you just mentioned. So 96% believes that religious movements, governing religious movements make countries weaker and worse off. It wasn't surprising to me because, I mean, it might sound surprising to you given the AKP's Islamist roots, but I think I've always argued that the people who voted for the AKP, they mostly vote for the AKP because they believe it's effective in governance, especially local governance, and also for its economic performance. So very few people within the AKP constituency vote for the AKP because it's an Islamist-rooted party. So the social fabric is not there. Islamism has never had a real appeal among the Turks. But also I think there is another factor to consider, and that is the Gülen effect. Fethullah Gülen is an Islamic organization, and that's believed to have infiltrated into state institutions and orchestrated last year's failed coup. So when you talk about an Islamist movement, they think of Gülen, and they manage to, almost all segments of society despise the Gülenist movement. The conservatives, the seculars, Kemalists, so everyone hates the movement. So after last year's, it was a trauma, after last year's failed coup attempt, many Turks are wary of any religious meddling in government affairs. But yeah, my question to Jim is, I can't come up with an explanation about why Turks view U.S.'s role in Syria positively. That's a huge question mark for me.
Gönül, thank you very much. Before turning to Jim for his comments on that, we're going to, after Jim's comments, turn to you for your questions and comments, so prepare them. Jim, your comments on Gönül, and also a few words about the sampling in Turkey, geographically and so on.
Well, that's also spelled out in the methodology in the back. In a country like Turkey or like Egypt, in other words, geographically very large, we've done polling in Egypt as much as 5,000, where we're able to get into the sort of the sinews of the society, but otherwise we have to focus largely in urban areas, and it's spelled out in the methodology, basically the coverage of areas that we went into. Let me just first comment on the AKP, which is interesting because in other polling that we've done, it is the one group that is exempt, the one Islamic group that's exempt across the region from the fear, contempt, or just modest dislike for religious movements in government. It gets extraordinarily high numbers everywhere, followed downscale, 20, 30 points downscale by Ennahda, and then after that it's in the pits for everybody else. But AKP is looked at in every other country that we poll in as sort of exempt from the religious. You're right. I mean, it's viewed as an effective governance movement. Now, does that survive some of the current policies? I don't know, but that's kind of where it is right now. You're also absolutely right that even in the best days, Turkey and Egypt compete with each other for who has the lowest favorable rating toward the United States. And sometimes they're within the margin of error of zero. I mean, it always surprised me because we'd see close ties and things developing and whatever, and then we'd poll in Turkey and we'd get 5% favorable rating. Now, we didn't poll favorable rating in this one, but we did poll importance of relationship. And there's no doubt that, and it may even be the Trump effect, that he's so wild, unpredictable, but the United States is so important, we got to have relations with these people. I mean, that was the way we framed the question, was importance of relations. But the one troubling or confusing one was the 70% who said that the U.S. policy in Syria was positive. And I really found that, I found that confusing, and I continue to find it confusing. It, again, doesn't translate to I like them, but it translates to they're playing a positive, not so positive a role in Iraq, in Turkish opinion, and I think that it's actually the only country in this group that we polled about where Turks gave it a positive rating for its I can go back and check it. Sometimes when we get a confusing number, we actually go back and not just look at the data, but we go back actually and re-poll. There were some questions here that we did go back and re-poll 50 to 100 of the people to say, did you really mean that? Tell me a little bit more about it. We didn't do that on this one. It probably would have
Jim,
warranted
could it have been because of ISIS, because of the U.S. role in fighting ISIS?
I don't know. Again, that's because we didn't ask it.
Yeah.
If we had gone back and said, give me more, we would have gotten some qualitative answers that could have helped explain it. That's one that we just did not, we did not do, but really negative toward Russia, really negative toward Iran, and really negative toward Saudi Arabia's role in Syria.
But about Barbara's question on the question of ISIS, I think there was another poll, I don't recall exactly the numbers now, but Turkish people don't really view ISIS as an existential threat the way they do PKK, so it can't be the ISIS effect. Yes, I would agree. I mean, Trump, Turkey really thought that, both the government and society thought that they would open a new chapter in relations with the U.S. under Trump. But this is, again, after May 2017, when the U.S. decided to directly arm the YPG. A few months after that, so it just...
Now here, the interesting ones in Turkey, though, about the question of the unsettling of Syria was the refugee questions, which you didn't really comment on. And that was that it appeared that when we compared the 2014 polling and the 2017 polling, that in Lebanon and in Jordan, there almost seemed to be a settling in of the, there's not so much of a threat to the security, it's not so big a threat to the economy. In Jordan, actually, the numbers, they felt it was positive to the economy, went up from 16% to 31%, still divided, 35% saying negative and no impact. But in Turkey, which I would have thought, and what we found in earlier polling, had no impact, 56% in 2014. Now, 89% say that they're having a negative impact on the economy in Turkey, and 76% saying a negative, 89% negative impact on security. So it may not be ISIS as such, but the fact of the border and the porousness of it and the number of Syrians who've come into the country posing an internal security threat. There have been bombings, there have been acts of terror, not all of them Kurdish related, and that may be a factor here in wanting to see the situation resolved in Syria. And 76% saying that it was having a negative impact on the economy.
On the question in 2014, first Turkish economy is doing worse now. That explains. So compared to 2014, and also 2015 was an important year in terms of ISIS targeting Turkey. So that was a turning point. And after that, I think the threat perception changed among Turkish public. So if you want to compare it with 2014, I think it makes sense.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Jim. Let's turn to questions from the audience. Raise your hand, and a microphone will come to you. The lady in the fourth row. And introduce yourself and a quick question.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services USA. Mr. Zogby, I'd like to return again, as we usually wind up doing, to Israeli-Palestinian issues. You were quite pessimistic about a two-state solution in the future and seeing matters deteriorate. Okay. There's the United States, but there are other countries. Is there anything that could come out of European leadership? I don't know about Emmanuel Macron. He's certainly new in office and controversial. Could perhaps a former Nobel Peace Prize winner emerge? Could NGO leaders emerge? I don't like to think that there is just a solid negative wall there. There are creative people. In the past, there was the ex-president of Finland, Ahtisaari. There were other people lurking. Perhaps some of them may emerge. I'd like your comments on that.
Thank you, Mindy. Let's take a few questions. Hands raised, gentlemen in the last row. Keep your hand up. Yes, there you go, sir.
Thank you so much for your presentation. You're doing a great job. My question is...
Could you introduce yourself?
my name is Arash, George Washington University. My question is specifically about Iran. And I looked through the methodology, and it seems to me that you have done this kind of polls in some major cities, 8 or 9, in Iran. And based on that, would you say that, or could you say that the results could be, represent the whole country? Because among these eight cities, none of them are, the cities are, for example, the majorities are Sunnis, and all of them majorities are Shia. And the second question, I didn't get your answer about how did you conduct a poll in Iran. Did you outsource the results, the organization to do this kind of poll, or you have a field in Iran or office in Iran and they are doing these kind of polls? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman in the third row.
Hi, I'm Richard, and I'm a student at George Washington University. I'm curious about if there was a generational differentiation in responses to the poll, especially with the large amount of millennials that live in the Middle East, and how they're a majority of the population. And if you don't know exactly the age of the people who responded, if you could talk a bit about how the attitude has changed over time, because that would be a good indication of generational differences. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Jim, and also Yousef, your comments maybe on the Arab-Israeli thing in general, and Barbara on urban-rural. Jim.
Okay, I'm going to actually let the Israeli-Palestinian discussion go to Yousef, because I'd rather stick to the polling, and we didn't ask about Europe playing a role or anybody else. I want to stick to the data here. I'll go to yours next. Interestingly enough, almost no generational difference. And you have in the back the methodology and the demographics. The one country where under 30 was the largest was the UAE, but in every other country it's between a third to 40 or so percent. And I think that the demographic break is pretty clear. But there are some questions where we would get a difference, but in the political questions we didn't get differences at all, and we do look for that to see whether or not it's worth noting. But there was not a gender difference, there wasn't an education difference, and there wasn't an income difference. I mean, it just again, there are some issues that you will find those hard demographic factors weighing in. They didn't weigh in on the political stuff at all. Mm-hmm. On Iran, we do not hire a company in Iran to do it. We have contractors that we've worked with there, and they hire mostly students and cover the demographics in the country. And as far as Sunni Shia, it is in Iran, it is 6% Sunni and 94% Shia. That's the response rate that we get. And the regional distribution is pretty thorough. So I'm pretty comfortable with the sample, the Iranian sample. And one of the reasons we don't work with an established company was we actually did. And in the second Khatami election, he got arrested. And I actually wanted to get the charge sheet, which actually somebody did send to me, because he was charged with working for the well-known Zionist company Zogby, which I had hoped might be helpful to me in some quarters in Washington, but it didn't work. Helpful in some quarters, harmful in others, but yeah, poor guy ended up serving a couple years in jail, and we have not worked with a company since. And then after the sanctions, we had to go through a whole rigorous process to get, and in part we're able to do it because there's a clause in the sanctions agreement that if you, and we're actually fulfilling the clause right now, if you poll for public information, if you do anything, it's like a stringer working for the New York Times. You can't spend money in Iran unless you're spending it to get information that you make public. So that's why we're able to do it, because we have that protection.
But I have to ask, Jim, I mean, those people you're working with in Iran,
They're at risk.
they just do it quietly.
They do it.
And
They do it, and that's the case in every country. We do now. It's not going to help in Iran, but we do get some backup letters that our field people don't have it, but our team managers do. And in some cases, we've had a problem with the Palestinian Authority, where we've had to show, look, this is what we are and this is what we're doing. But we only use it if there becomes a problem.
Interesting.
And
Yousef, your views on
yeah.
hope.
Yeah, so, I don't necessarily look at these as pessimistic numbers. I think what they are indicative of, though, is a turning of the page in an era on this two-state discussion that is very much coming to a close. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're going in one direction and it's not working out, the sooner you realize that and turn in another direction, the better. So whatever direction is the preferred policy option, the reality is there is a dramatic power imbalance between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Whether we're talking about one state or two, neither of these outcomes are going to come to fruition in any just and equitable way unless there is external intervention to mediate that power imbalance. And unfortunately, I think the biggest problem has been that hasn't been the case, right? It's very clear that our government playing the role of mediator has its thumbs on the scale of the much stronger party. And the outcome of that is, obviously, the Israelis are able to impose their will on the Palestinians and continuously reshape the map in a direction further and further away from the stated outcome of two states. So I think, this could be very positive in the fact that it's clarifying, informing policy of the need to shift direction. I don't think we've seen that. I think that has to eventually happen in the future, or else you're going to see a continued descent into periodic violence. And obviously that's something that doesn't serve anybody's interest. But we have seen some action from international organizations. We have seen some action from civil society, but it hasn't really translated yet into policy from the capitals that have the most sway over Israel, which is most importantly this city we're in right here.
Let me just say that I'm on the one state, two state. I'm not prescribing, I'm describing where attitudes are. That then sets the stage for how do we either change those perceptions or how do we work with those perceptions to get where we are. But I found this poll quite worrisome in terms of the degree of what I found Palestinian despair. I never saw 40% say it's just not possible before. They've settled in on that. That's not a good place to be. What we do with that and what the United States does with that, what regional players deal with that, I would say don't screw around when you got 40% saying it's not possible. Don't create expectations you're not going to realize. And recognize that you have a very volatile mix here in public opinion that I think is worthy of attention. And that goes for the whole thing. It's like, you know, countries may want to do something, but if 90% of your people are saying don't, you can do it, but there are consequences. I mean, you know, I always point to the fact that because we've been doing polling in the region, I fell in love with the King Crane Commission, first poll ever commissioned in the Middle East, and the first poll ignored in the Middle East, and the consequences are still with us today. And so, you know, we're like little King Cranes doing our work right now, and still being ignored when we say, this is what people are saying, this is what they're feeling right now, pay attention.
I would just add one thing to that to emphasize the importance of these numbers. For quite a long time, as this discussion about what the appropriate policy is, what the appropriate aim is, whether it makes sense to continue in the direction of two states or one, those who've looked at the situation on the ground, looked at the degree of entanglement between the populations, look at it and say it's impossible to create separation here. This doesn't make sense. It's better to unify than to divide, or easier to unify than to divide. The retort has always been, in defense of the two-state position, actually the majority of publics on both sides prefer a two-state outcome. And that had been the case for a number of years, and it's very clear now from the numbers that that's no longer the case. And so at the very minimum, it demands a real reevaluation of policy when the physical reality on the ground and the preferences of the stakeholders are shifting away from the stated outcome.
Thanks, Yousef. Barbara, any quick comment on the rural-urban?
Yeah, I mean, Iran is now over 70% urban. So, you know, the distinction really is not as important as it used to be, and you see this also in the various elections that are held, where there's less of a difference now between the rural vote and the urban vote than we used to see in the past. Everybody lives in the big cities.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Barbara. Last round of questions. The gentleman in the fourth row.
It's actually fifth.
Fifth, you're good at numbers and polling. Fifth row, correct.
Yeah, my name is
He
Steve.
was confused, I know.
My name is Stephen Faulkner. I was just visiting from the State Department. I was just wanting to get a quick comment regarding the numbers of those that prefer one state over two state in Palestine, whether or not you see a direct correlation between, or if that is one of the questions that you would say is a main difference in a generational kind of a gap or correlation between those attitudes, because the former Prime Minister, Fayyad, was at the Wilson Center yesterday, and I made a little daring thing, and I actually asked him about the one-state kind of solution. He shot it down pretty quickly. And so does the data kind of demonstrate that it is kind of a generational shift toward a one-state, or is that, is it just something that's popping up because of the despair?
Thank you, Steve. Other questions? Lady in the far back.
Thank you. My name is Mariah Yeager, and I'm with NSI, and I have a two-part question. And first, forgive me that I haven't read the report yet, but you've commented on the polling of perception of U.S. policy in the region, but did you poll on perception of U.S. military and military action in the region, or potentially U.S. proxies in the region? And then follow up maybe to the entire panel. Given this maybe increased secularization and nationalism in the region, is there a role for the U.S. military in supporting this, and what could that be? Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody in this region? A gentleman in the third row. Keep your...
Hi, my name is Delavan Barwari, PC Foundation, and I'm interested to know how you measured the level of support for independence in Iraqi Kurdistan, because the recent referendum, 80% turnout and 93% voted yes. And you mentioned that the support was somewhere around a little bit over 50% in Suli area. I don't know if that was the only place you measured. But in terms of political support for independence among PUK region, which is the green zone but in Iraqi Kurdistan, the same, during the referendum, in city of Khanaqin and Kirkuk, which are PUK dominated, the area of PUK zone, the level of support for independence was more than 90%. In Khanaqin, for instance, it had the highest level of support. It had close to 98% yes vote. And in other cities as well, like in Duhok and Erbil, I believe the participation rate was over 90% in Duhok, and 95% voted yes. So that comment and question, how
Thank you.
was the poll measured in Iraqi Kurdistan?
Thank you. Lady in the third row.
Thank you. My name is Omnia Al-Hakim. I am a diversity director, former diversity director and assistant dean for engineering, Colorado State University. Thank you for the presentation and the discussion. My question is focusing on the Saudi Arabia, the people themselves and their relationship with their administration and their government. And also before and after Trump is taking the presidency. And I also interested in knowing about women in Saudi Arabia and how did they vote? Did they went to? Are they active more now than before? And what kind of relationship there? That is there any anticipation of a spring movement or something could happen in the Saudi Arabia themselves?
Thank you. A final question. There were some hands in the recent past, but yes, the lady in the fourth row.
Hi, my name is Sharon Kotak, and I was surprised that the Turkish people consider the Gülenist movement to be a religious movement, but don't consider Erdogan to be a religious person, because it's my understanding that the schools, the Gülenist schools that Erdogan closed, kind of focus on science and math, and that Erdogan wants the schools really to focus more on religious studies. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to Jim and final comments from our panelists. Jim.
The question about, I'm going to be very honest with you about the generational issue on one state, two states. I don't know. But I'll give you my email address. It's jzogby@aaiusa.org. Write me, and I will check that out and get back to you with the answer. I just don't think there was a difference, because we didn't find in the areas where we did look, we didn't find a significant generational difference. But on that particular question, I don't know, so I will look. The question on U.S. role, remind me what that was.
Is the view of the military different?
Yeah, I think if you're talking about the U.S. role in Iraq or Syria, you're talking about a military role. And so attitudes towards it translate to one and the same thing. And so we didn't sort of spell out the question, what do you think about the U.S. military role? I think it's understood. And I would use the numbers that we've got to, sort of be responsive to that particular question. Nationalism and religion. In the book I did in 2090.
Jim, you really got it.
I'm
get
old.
A handle on
2009. 2009.
2010, actually. I got you.
Would be nice if we were. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. In 2010, Arab Voices. I tracked Arab attitudes towards identity. It was always interesting to me in the Gulf states, the lack of state identity, of national identity. In Saudi Arabia or in UAE in particular, the question is, how do you most identify? And we would ask it in a number of different ways. It was as Arab. That was the principal source of identity. It is now being Emirati. It is now being Saudi. And a number of factors have contributed to that. It is not necessarily secular, and we shouldn't make that confusion that being Saudi means I'm secularist. It means that my identity is tied up with being a Saudi Muslim in that particular setting. And that, in the same way that an Iranian can say, I'm Iranian, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he's saying he's making a secular claim, like being American versus Christian with some, but certainly not in Alabama these days. It might be translated as the same thing.
But Jim, I mean, the findings here that 84% think that religious movements should restrict themselves to personal faith and spiritual guidance. Is it the same thing as with Turkey, where they don't see their own government as being a religious government?
Right.
And so when they're looking at political movements, maybe they're, you know.
They're
it's-
looking at a political movement,
like
i.e.
the Muslim Brotherhood, right,
right.
and saying that it weakens a country.
Right.
Okay.
Which is your point about the Gulen movement, different than AKP in the perception. I'm going to get the Kurdish one last. The
Saudi women.
Saudi women didn't poll on that. We have polled in earlier polls. We've polled on it, and we find, interestingly enough, that Saudi men had historically more liberal attitudes on women's roles than Saudi women did. And I remember saying that to Liz Cheney one time at the State Department. We did a briefing for her, and I mean, not for her, but for the whole group. And she was like indignant over it. And I said, sorry, ma'am. I mean, that's just what the numbers, and the numbers show that every single time. That has changed. And the difference is now we do find a difference on that issue, but the difference is whether or not they have an educated parent. It is not their education, it is not their income level, it is principally whether or not they have a parent, a mother or a father who's been educated. And in that case, women will have more progressive, more liberal attitudes. So the change in Saudi Arabia comes in the next generation as more women get educated and then begin to change the way their children begin to see their futures and their outlooks. So I don't have numbers. We never asked a question about driving, for example. We have done extensive polling for the Riyadh Development Authority on quality of life in the city. Again, very little difference between men and women on most questions, but a lot of hope that real change is coming, and in particular in areas that have been projected in 2030, education, healthcare, recreation possibilities, and the need for having a fuller social life with your families and friends. All of those things, there's a real sense of we're moving in the right direction on those. Turkey, I'm going to defer to you on that one, but on the Kurdish question. The Kurdish numbers were confounding. It wasn't 80% turnout, it was about 70% turnout in any case. We tried to get as much data on that as we could, and it simply wasn't, there were neither exit polls nor were the election authorities as forthcoming in providing the data, so you actually got, it was all anecdotal, 90% here, 80% there, I don't know. What I do know is that we were so confounded by these numbers that we re-polled. We re-polled, and we came up with the same thing. We polled in all of the areas where there would be a Kurdish population. Actually, we polled in all of the areas where there was a population period, and we asked the question of ethnicity. And so we pulled out the segment of those who were Kurds to come up with those numbers. They were in Kurdistan, they were in Kirkuk, and they were elsewhere in Iraq, where there were people who identified or said that they were Kurdish. How did they, when I mentioned Suleymaniye, it was just because that is the heaviest area of population concentration. It was also the lowest turnout in the election, which says something. But in other areas as well, we found the same results. The country was split on this question. And how they voted may not necessarily be the same as how they felt. That could be one thing. It could also be that what they told us was not the same. I mean, there are a lot of people who wouldn't say they'd vote for Donald Trump, but they voted for Donald Trump. A lot of people might have said, I don't support Kurdish independence, but then went and voted for it, thinking that it may not happen anyway. I mean, so I don't know. I can't get into again, if we don't do the why questions and do follow-up focus group stuff, we don't get a lot of that data. I can only tell you what I found, and I stand by what I found, and these are the numbers that we had. It appears to me from this that Kurdish society in Iraq is divided on the question. The election, which had a 70-something% turnout, came out differently. There are people rethinking that now because of the consequences of what it might look like. I don't know, it'd be interesting to do it again. You want to hire me? I'll go back and we'll try it. Try it again.
Thank you, Jim.
I think it's an interesting issue, though, and because it was so confounding to us, we went and resurveyed, and we came up with the same thing.
Thanks, Jim. We're basically out of time, but any last comments? I know there was one.
Oh,
on,
there was the
Gulen.
Turkish question.
On Turkey,
I mean, we
you're,
will come back to.
you're right
yeah.
to be confused. I mean, but if you look at Turkey and the people who voted for the AKP, I think the majority, not only the people, well, not just the AKP's core constituency, but Turkey is a conservative country, and the majority doesn't really think that AKP is an Islamist party. In terms of, I mean, he never laid out a plan to create and establish a theocracy, for instance. He very often talks about raising pious generations. So that means education, and he took steps for that. But that is not a problem in a conservative country. When it comes to Islamicizing the state, then that is a problem. And only a fraction of Turkish society, the seculars, think that AKP is Islamicizing the state. But if you look at AKP's actions since 2002, that has not been the case. So he is trying to raise a pious generation, but that's not a problem. So the problem with the Gülen movement is that they sinned when they tried to infiltrate into the state institutions. So that's a big no-no for the majority of Turkish population, who still think that the state should it stays secular, and that's important. So there's a very tiny segment that thinks AKP is Islamist and the country should become a theocracy. But other than that, the majority thinks it's
Thank
not.
you. Thank you, Gönül. Barbara, any last comment on anything?
Well, just on Turkey, I mean, Erdogan is not a cleric, so obviously he's not going to let Turkey become a theocracy because he would be putting himself out of a job.
Good point. Yousef.
Just one last point on this, because it's come up a number of times on this question of secularization and perhaps a move away from sort of religion throughout the region. I know from the perspective here in the West that might seem like something we would want to embrace, but I would also look at it with a degree of caution. Nationalism can also be a hell of a drug. And can be a substitute for religion in many cases. And I would be wary of conflating trends towards secularization with trends towards pluralism or more democratic forms of government. And what we may be seeing instead is just a switch of populist vehicles that allow regimes to consolidate power and to continue doing what perhaps religion may no longer be as successful in allowing them to do in the moment.
Thank you, Yousef. Well, Jim has shared with you his email address. So any further issues and questions, you can ask him.
And you can check on, look, the website is www.zogbyresearchservices.com, one word. Twitter is Zogby_research, and my Twitter handle is JJZ1600, and follow what we do. I think, let me just say in conclusion, I really appreciate you all doing this, but I also appreciate the fact that we've had this opportunity that Sir Banias has given us to do these, and the conversations that ensue from thought leaders with this data is always really fascinating, because public opinion matters, and there are people who care about it and think about it, and that has not always been the case, but it is today. And so I'm finding that it's important that people are saying, what do our people think, and what do we do about what they think? And this is the beginning of, I think, an exciting enterprise. I mean, if Arab Spring did anything, it was to make people, government and people, aware of the importance of paying attention to what people think. Mm-hmm. And so we have an opportunity to do it, and I thank you, MEI, for letting us have a podium to
Thank
talk
you.
about
Please
it.
join me in thanking Jim and the panel.